This is We Bleed Orange and Black, the podcast for Halloween and horror lovers. Join us as we interview creators, discuss our favorite horror, and share original spooky stories. I'm Jeff C. Carter, and this week we're talking with Emma E. Murray about her new book, The Drowning Machine and Other Obsessions. Emma E. Murray explores the dark side of humanity in her fiction, with work including Crushing Snails, When the Devil, and Shoot Me in the Face on a Beautiful Day. When she isn't writing, she loves making up fantastical worlds with her daughter, playing D&D, retro video games, and hiking. Welcome to the show, Emma.
Thanks for having me. I'm excited to be here.
Icebreaker question. What is your favorite retro game?
Oh, King's Quest. I'm a huge Sierra online person. So yes, I also love Quest for Glory, Police Quest, Space Quest, King's Quest.
The colors back then. I don't know, something about that limited color palette. I absolutely love it. Do you have like a CRT or anything? Like how deep do you go on the retro rabbit hole?
I mean, I wish I did. I used to, obviously. I'm old enough to have played them on that. But I need to get like a retro setup, honestly. But I mainly just play on like emulators. It's the easy way.
Emma, this is our first conversation, so can you tell us a bit about yourself?
I write horror. I'm a stay-at-home mom. I used to be a teacher. I taught first grade for many years. I have my master's in elementary education, and my undergrad is in psychology, and I minored in literature. I went to grad school for literature for a little while, but I decided I didn't want to be a professor, and so that's why I switched over to elementary ed, because my dad had actually been a child psychologist and then an elementary school teacher. And I still sometimes miss teaching, but I'm really grateful to be able to stay home and also to work on my career as a writer. I'm really like a full-time writer now.
Let's talk about dying children for the next 17 stories.
I know, right? So it would seem like I must not love children because how many of my stories have to do with teenagers and children in danger, but really it comes from how much I do love children and teenagers and want to understand how they understand the world and my own empathy for them. And also a lot of my stories have to do with mothers. And as a mother, that's why there's so many kids in danger, because it is one of my biggest fears. And so I'm going to write about it.
This wouldn't be a collection of horror stories if it wasn't obvious how much you dread things happening to children. That comes across very, very clearly. This book is The Drowning Machine and Other Obsessions. Do you have a back of the book summary for this?
In these 18 stories, Emma E. Murray navigates uncharted waters of love, lust, and loss, descending into that darkest of places, the human and inhuman heart. Amidst the spiral and churn, you will hear frighteningly realistic tales of parental regret, the death of innocence, carnal yearning, and creeping evil, among other voices of the damned. Some are ferocious howls from out of the deep, others tender lullabies or deranged arias of grief, and beneath it all, the quiet, contented hum of something which has just been fed, yet hungers for more. With stories that have been previously published in such venues as Vestarian and Cosmic Horror Monthly, as well as critically acclaimed anthologies, Emma E. Murray's virtuosic prose takes the reader to the very root of the vortex and will leave them gasping for breath. So my editor, TJ, wrote that, and I love him. TJ Price.
I also love TJ. How'd you guys get connected?
I think we met on Discord originally, like in just a random Discord, but I love him. But you can totally hear his voice in that, and I love it. It's such a love letter to my stories. But I am like, whoa, he is very TJ, and I love it.
Yeah. Yeah, TJ's the best.
He reads so fast and so much. It's crazy. I am so impressed.
This collection is divided into 3 parts. I think I've sniffed out some themes.
They're not arranged exactly how some people have said, where people are like, this is motherhood and this is childhood and then this is kind of other is what I've heard a couple people think. And I'm like, that's not quite it. The beginning is motherhood and parenthood. The middle is more about innocence, because they're not just about children. It's more about like being naive, the death of innocence. And the last part is really the most about obsession, because all of them have elements of obsession. And there's definitely themes that run throughout the entire collection. And even like, I love how there's like little callbacks to like details in another story. And like, I think there's a lot of fun little Easter egg type things like that throughout, who probably like nobody else will ever notice, but that's okay. But the last part is really like obsession. And there's also actually a through line about growing up because the beginning, even though it's mother stories, it has a lot to also do with the very beginning of childhood. The middle part has a lot more of coming into, honestly, like realizing who you are, like we were talking about, an identity, and realizing that the world isn't necessarily how you thought it was. And then at the end, it kind of goes more into there, there's some lust stories, and then even old age, like the last stories, the last two have to do with getting to that twilight of your life. And so that was one of the reasons I arranged it that way too.
The first story I picked out was If I Carry You.
I love that one. Well, I love all of them.
You have to love them all. Can you tell us about this story?
So this one was originally in the anthology Ooze by Ruth Anna Evans. And it was a story that actually came to me kind of all at once when I was listening to a song. It's actually so a lot of these stories are also kind of inspired by my own intrusive thoughts. I have OCD, and so that's why it's in other obsessions a little bit, playing with that. But this was kind of coming from a place of whenever I was a newer mom, my daughter was, I think she was like 2 when I wrote this one, because I didn't write it and then immediately get it into the anthology. It wasn't written for that. It was one that I just submitted for that. And so it was really about how would I deal with some of these worst fears and wanting to do everything for your child and give up whatever you had to, even if it meant like physical pain or, honestly, even your own life, like for your child. And so it's really a love letter. That's why, honestly, the whole collection is actually dedicated to my daughter. And so it's a lot about a love letter to being a parent.
This one could be read as body horror, but
yes.
And technically, yes. I thought this story was absolutely beautiful, very moving. I'm going to go out on a limb and say something wild here. It's no more body horror than being a mother and pregnancy is. It's just sort of a reverse pregnancy. It is no more gory or terrible. It's just sort of bringing the act of pregnancy full circle.
Mm-hmm.
But yeah, wow. This might even be my favorite story in the collection. I really thought it was powerful.
Thank you. Yeah, I mean, you're right. Pregnancy is body horror. In the whole idea of like, not just like the gory bits of it, but it's changing, like becoming something totally different. And your body never changes completely back, And so, yeah, I think it's horror, but in a way it is beautiful in the same way as pregnancy, which is horrific and beautiful. So I'm glad that you liked it so much, because I do think it's a tender story, and it's one that still makes me tear up a little bit whenever I read it.
Yeah, I mean, the tenderness is there in every line and image. It really is impressive that you could write such an intense body horror about a dying child and a mother's grief and make it tender and beautiful. Yeah, definitely a standout for me.
Thank you. It always means a lot to me whenever people are like, oh, this story, I really got it. Because like sometimes I feel like, especially with horror and grief horror and bringing in things like children and adolescents that are dealing with death and stuff, people sometimes jump to conclusions about like, this is too much, or you're trying to be edgy or something, instead of seeing like the tenderness in a lot of these stories.
Now let's punish that naivete in part 2. That innocence destroyed. One story I picked out was The Night Visitor.
Yes, I love that one.
All right. Give us a recap of this one.
It's funny. So The Night Visitor is a story that I had thought about writing for a really long time, because it actually has this whole crazy lore behind it, which is that my dad, whenever he was in, like, I think he was in the Air Force and he was stationed overseas, is that he swears he read a book called The Night Visitor, and that it's opened, like the actual book, like that he swears exists, started by saying, now that you start reading this, the night visitor is going to come to you. And he's like, I can't really remember anything else about it. And I have looked for this book for my like whole life. Okay. I want to read it so bad. I've done like, those Reddits, like help me find this book. Like I've posted about it everywhere. I've talked about it on multiple podcasts, trying to get people to be like, oh, I've read that book. It does not seem to exist. And I've tried lots of different variations, because maybe he remembers the name of it wrong. I cannot find, I think he's making it up, honestly, or he misremembers. But then I was like, okay, Dad, screw you. I think that you made this up, or you were high or something. So I was like, I'm going to write The Night Visitor. And so it was like, what do I think this is a short story version instead of a whole book, but like, what do I think that story that's so ominous that you start reading it, that the night visitor will come to you? What could I do with that? And I thought it was really fun to play with the idea of this night visitor that's going to visit you no matter what, and that you cannot escape it because you've selected your fate just by opening the book.
I bet TJ has the night visitor on his shelf.
I
Original copy.
He needs to find it for me then, because you're right. He knows like every book ever. And I'm like, at this point, I just don't think it exists.
The night visitor has a sort of choose your own adventure quality, but it also reminded me of these like Japanese urban legends where like if you meet Slitmouth Woman, if you meet Hanako, she's going to ask you a question and you have to answer in a certain way, or this bad thing will happen, or this other bad thing will happen. I liked the weird, variable, procedural lore that you came up for with the night visitor, because each option is bad, but they're bad in totally different ways. Like the things you explore that the night visitor will bring to you or do to you, they're all pretty horrific. But it's not just a one-note kind of fate that you find yourself doomed to.
Yeah, I really love that, actually, of thinking about it like those folk tales, because I hadn't considered that part of it. But I did try and approach it as like how we do make choices in our life that don't have like the best outcomes sometimes, and how we have to really think about what we want out of it. And that's what the night visitor is coming, because he's not actually malicious in a lot of ways. He's letting you choose what is going to happen to an extent. Like,
it's pretty malicious.
I think of him as more like kind of like in Hellraiser. I don't think that the Cenobites are malicious. I think that we just view them that way because we don't want that. I mean, most of us don't want that.
Angels to some, demons to others.
And so I think that that's more what I was going for, is that he doesn't necessarily see what he's giving you as something bad. Like it's a gift that you're choosing from him. The poor night visitor, just tearing him apart.
Well, we're already stuck. We started reading the story, and so now we're stuck with the night visitor. So I feel like he's stuck with us. We're not trapped in the night visitor story. He's trapped in there with us.
Yeah, you're right. You started reading it. He also doesn't have a choice but to come and be like, which one of these things do you want? In a way, out of his hands, actually.
Another story I want to touch upon in this section is Portage, Ohio in early autumn.
So I've lived all over the place. And for a little while, I lived in Bowling Green, Ohio, which is really close to Portage, Ohio, which is where I had a relative that lived there, and we would go stay with her. And she lives like, there's just cornfields everywhere there. And so she lived like right at the edge of all these cornfields, and would always be really worried about us getting lost in there. And one time my little sister, she was only like 4, I think. She was super little, like went missing. And we were sure she was in the corn, and it was the most stressful thing in the world. But then thankfully she was actually asleep, like under a bed. So she wasn't in the corn, but it did kind of inspire the story, because I'd actually been talking to my sister and we kind of making fun of her about it a little bit. And I was like, yeah, getting lost in the corn actually is really scary. Because I have walked into a cornfield, and like, if it's not one of those ones that's like super neat, like easy to navigate, or like a corn maze or something, you get lost immediately, like, especially if you have a bad sense of direction like me. I'm like 5 steps in and I don't remember how to get out of here. And so I was like, I'm going to play with that. But then it has this, this other side of it, kind of like how my sister wasn't actually in the corn. There's, in this story, there's an evil side of it, that she might not actually be in the corn.
I think there's been an uptick in corn-based horror. I think cornfields are so creepy. I love a good corn maze. In 2020, during COVID, where it was sort of not certain, I think Halloween Horror Night was canceled. Like, they weren't doing giant mazes and stuff. There was a pumpkin patch sort of corn maze place that was all open air outdoors. And so they had set up an open air haunt. We were all masked up and we were going through this corn maze. And I remember, like, it was just sort of a mediocre haunt that was now open air. But I looked back and I saw the silhouette of this thing shambling through the fog and through the corn in front of a light, and its shadows sort of strobed across the corn, and I was like, holy shit. That was so fucking cool. It's like that one perfect moment that you hope to get from like a haunted house or a horror movie or something like that. And I'm like, that was it. And at that same place, we went through a legit corn maze, but it was at night. And people were plowing through the corn, totally lost. I remember one time I went into a corn maze during the day. I had a little brother with me, and it was like, oh, we're lost. And it is hot out. This was in Los Angeles. It was 80 degrees. We were in the corn getting baked. I literally have to figure out how to get out of here because I have a young child who did not dress for this weather. We don't have enough water with us. So, like, I had to sort it out.
I love a good corn maze, too. It is scary. You're right. Like, yeah, especially like, I can't imagine how good that looked with like the lights and the fog and the corn and stuff. Yeah.
Perfect.
Good haunt like that is priceless.
The last corn maze I went to was when my wife and I were going pumpkin picking. And there was a sign like, don't rip off the corn, don't peel the corn, don't uproot the corn. And we saw like this one boy who had ripped out an entire stalk and was swinging around like a sword. There were all these girls who were posing for selfies. They had ripped up a bunch of corn and were like holding it. And I was like, that's not cool. We saw this train. It was like an elephant shaking the corn. It was a guy pushing a stroller. They had a newborn baby and like 8 people with them. And they decided to just use their stroller to bulldoze their own path through the corn. Why did you bring a newborn into a corn maze?
Wow. Oh, wow. That's terrible.
Yeah.
That's a bad parents, to be honest.
Bad parents. Do not bring a newborn into a corn maze with nothing but Mountain Dew.
And you're using the stroller to go through the corn like, here, you sacrifice yourself, baby.
Yeah.
Wow. That's crazy. Oh my God. I would have been so mad if I saw that. I would have definitely had to say something.
Like your story. A better mother. So this brings us to part 3, Obsession. Can you tell us about your tale, Vengeance is a Patient Beast?
Yeah, so that one is actually my husband's favorite of all of my writing. And so he was really, really glad whenever not only did it finally first find a home, but and it was in Cosmic Horror Monthly, but then whenever it's in the collection, because he's like, more people need to read this one. It got rejected so much. I actually almost gave up on it. And so I was glad it did finally find such a good home. And because it is a more subtle horror, it's definitely the most quiet of all the stories. It's about really like guilt, and you can't outrun your sins, like that things will come back and karma will get you, essentially.
I really like the story because the first half had me weepy and totally committed, and then you flipped it in a way that was so cool.
I mean, it really gets into how every person has so many different parts of them. Like, it starts with this older man, Gustav, and his wife died and she's been ill for a while. There's like an IV hanger there, and he wakes up and she had died in the night, and it's about his grief and how he doesn't feel like he can go on without her, and he's contemplating suicide. But then in the second half of the story, you find out that he did some not so great things in his past. In fact, really, really terrible things. And how people can be both of those things, like someone can be like the most amazing partner and also have been like a total asshole to somebody else, or they're like, whenever you hear from like murderers, parents will be like, oh, but they're the best son and they're so sweet. And they, I can't imagine they're a good dad and this and that. Or like neighbors are always like, he seemed like such a great guy, like John Wayne Gacy Jr. People were always like, oh, he was amazing. He was a pillar of the community. Then he was also a serial killer. And so people can have multiple parts of them and have a past that's different from the person that you knew, and so I think that it's really getting into that psychology of it. And I love that worked for you, that you were on his side until you realized maybe you shouldn't be.
Gustav was not a serial killer or anything so extreme. You really paint this picture of a caretaker, someone who's achingly lonely, and you humanize him so well before the twist. Even the twist itself, when his past sin is revealed and comes back to haunt him, it's a really tragic thing that happened.
It is.
You know, it probably won't make the final podcast, but Emma and I were just going back and forth for 20 minutes about the Drow and D&D and character alignment and Hellraisers and morality and stuff like that. But, like, Gustav was not a monster.
No.
He is very human, and he made very human mistakes, very human choices. And at the end of his life, you know, he was a family man who was struggling with all the grief and tragic weight of old age and marriage and love. So the thing that has been on his heels this whole time, for so long that he actually forgot about it, because he really is living his last days and hours. Wow, what a story. Incredible. I can't believe this got rejected anywhere, because it fucking rules.
Thank you. Yeah, I really love that one. And the story, yeah, it kind of came to me in different ways. Like as I was writing it, yeah, I didn't actually know where it was going. It was one of those like where you kind of write in like a trance almost. And you're just like, oh, I know, I understand now what's going to have to happen, and going back and changing little things. And yeah, actually, I love Gustav. I don't think that he deserves the guilt that he does carry all his life. He definitely made a mistake. And it definitely was not good. Like, it had terrible consequences. But I do think it's a little bit about just like how you torture yourself in a way too, and how we all probably do that. Like, who doesn't have something that really just hangs over them? And whenever you're can't sleep and you're thinking about like, oh, I can't believe I was like that, or I said that.
Are there any stories you want to cover that we haven't touched upon?
One of my favorite stories is the very last story, Follow the Moon, which I actually have to say thank you a million to TJ, because he's the one who helped me with the weird formatting. It has an interesting way of exploring. So basically, it's about an elderly woman and she has dementia. And it was inspired by my grandmother, is in the late stages of Alzheimer's right now. And I remember talking with her whenever it first started happening, and some of the really terrible hallucinations she was having, like some of them, like they're not exactly like in the story, but it was definitely inspired by that. That's such a fear of mine now, and how terrible it is to go through that and be so confused. You're, just upset because things don't make sense. So I love that TJ worked with me, because he read it because it was originally just without any weird formatting. It had some brackets that I tried to do and stuff, but it wasn't nearly what it became, where he was like, I can do this. And so we worked together and he made it perfect, because I feel like with the strange formatting, it really puts you in her mind, how things aren't making sense. And you can almost like feel the palpable confusion and everything, and the fear she's having of just everyday things. Like she, forgets who people are. She doesn't remember what time period it is. She mistakes her own daughter for her mother. The whole Follow the Moon thing came from my own grandmother back before it was so bad. She at one point did go out in the night and sat in my aunt's van that she lives with, and because she thought she was late for a doctor's appointment, but it was like the middle of the night, and she sat out there for hours and hours and nobody knew she was out there. That was terrifying for everybody, for the caretakers too and stuff. And so I really think that story it gets to something that's a really real horror. I write about a lot of things that are, I have some supernatural stories, but I do tend to write about things that are more like real horrors. And I think dementia is actually one of the most terrifying things that can happen to a person. And I think that the story kind of is, I don't know, it's kind of like in honor of her in a way, because I do feel for her, but it's also exploring my own fears about it. And I think it really is a great way to end the collection. I'm really proud of that, because Brett Mitchell-Kent did illustrations for a couple stories. He did 6 illustrations, and one of them is for Follow the Moon. And it has the last page, and then it has this beautiful picture that's really kind of disturbing of this older woman in this moon. And I just feel like it really encapsulates that whole feeling of the collection, which is kind of this uneasy, unsettling, kind of disturbing kind of horror that's kind of under the surface versus that outright like jump scare kind of horror, which is really me. And that's why I feel like this collection really shows like what I try and do with horror.
It's an incredible story. Definitely one of my greatest fears. So really challenging and horrific because it is so real and raw, and so many people who have older relatives. The unorthodox typography that TJ put into the story really makes it feel original and jarring. And even though the character is confused, it is very clear when you read it that these are the changes and the misfires and the breakdown that's happening of this woman's brain. There's nothing that takes you out of the story because it's confusing. It is very clearly confusing. You get all of the disorientation without being disoriented. That's a very fine line that you walked, and very impressive.
Thank you. I'm so glad that it works, because that's always like my thing is I'm like, I hope that people get what I'm trying to get across in these stories. And so that one especially, I did the very first draft I had, a couple of my friends read it, and yeah, it was too confusing. So I really worked on trying to make it obvious to the reader what was happening, but also, yeah, like it needs to be the confusion so you're in her mind and being confused with her. But yeah, if it's too confusing, who wants to read it, right?
Right. Did the person who did the interior art also do the cover art?
So the cover art was done by Matthew Revert, who he also did Crushing Snails. And I just recently had a cover reveal for Shoot Me in the Face on a Beautiful Day. And he also did that one. And I just absolutely love his covers. He does beautiful covers. And I think that he's so good at getting, like, because I was like, I'm really not an artist. I can't draw any kind of mock-up or anything to describe it. So I was kind of just like, here is like this real thing, the drowning machine, which is like a low head dam. And I was like, there's this really scary sign that is a real warning sign next to these dams. And I want it to be like that, but with like the feel of my collection, which is very feminine. It's very, disturbing, dark. You're like stuck in that machine, and he just made this beautiful cover like out of nowhere. Like, and I'm just like, wow, I'm so glad that you knew what I was trying to say.
Yeah, it's a super cool cover. I feel like this is a perfect opportunity to talk about Shoot Me in the Face.
Yeah, so I'm really excited. It's my second novel coming out from Apocalypse Party in August. So it's kind of a dual story. It's partially, it's actually an own voices story in ways that I was in a really terrible domestic violent relationship. And I'm a survivor of that. And I wanted to write about that and the complications of it. Because I feel like most fiction that deals with it makes it very cut and dry, where it's like, she usually is the girl's the victim, and then there's a guy who's like the abuser, and it's very obvious. And then, she leaves and conquers it and everything. And I was like, it's so much more complicated. And like, that's why people who are in it, and when you're in support groups and stuff, it's like people are like, why didn't you leave? Or like, why would you put up with that? Or like, you're a smart person. Like, how could you let that happen to you? And so it's really about like the manipulations and the complication whenever you love someone and they're also abusive. And I'm really thankful to not be in a relationship like that. It's actually dedicated to my husband, because I'm like, he showed me that I can be in an amazing relationship. But it's got that. And so it's about Birdie, and she is in this really complicated relationship with this guy, Russ. But then at the same time, there is this serial killer who has descended on this community. And so he's a home invasion serial killer, which is one of my biggest fears ever. Like, is somebody breaking into my home? Please don't break into my home, listeners. And so he is targeting women and breaking into their homes and killing them. And it's kind of like, how do these stories converge? Because he is kind of accused of these murders, and it's about like whether she believes that he's actually involved or not. And it's kind of like got a little bit of like figuring out the mystery, but not so much her figuring out the mystery as much as the reader figuring out the mystery. It's also, as all my things are, it's actually really tied to the drowning machine, is that it's about a mother, because she's also a mother who's grieving. She lost her son, and that's a big reason why her life fell apart. Like she lost her husband because they couldn't stay together, because it's like she has a lot of guilt about the situation, about how her son died. And so she kind of stays in this relationship partially because she feels like she deserves to be punished. And so she has to go through a lot, poor Birdie. And so that's what it's all about.
Clearly, you have a talent for short stories. Was that all building the muscles so you could write novels? Do you find them both equally easy? Are you more of a novel writer, more of a short story writer?
Oh, that's hard to say. I think different stories really lend themselves to different lengths.
For sure.
And whenever they come to me, I usually know immediately, like, oh, this is a short story, this is a novel. I'm not that kind of writer that starts writing something and then it grows and grows and grows, which happens to so many of my writer friends.
Mm-hmm.
I think that must be really fun in a way, but mine usually come to me pretty like, okay, I can tell, even if I don't know where it's going for sure, I can tell the length. But I would never think of writing short stories as like practice for writing a novel. I think that they're just really different. And I honestly really wish that short stories were more appreciated by people outside of writers and like people in the literary sphere, because I love short stories. I read so many collections. There's so many amazing short stories, and it is a very, very different thing to successfully land a short story than a novel, because it has a very different pacing, trying to get the characterization in there. Like, you just don't have the same amount of time.
I agree. I absolutely love short stories. I love writing short stories. Someone has a quote: novels win on points, short stories have to win by a knockout.
Great quote.
For me, it's short stories and it's novellas. Because novellas free you up to get a little freakier than a short story, maybe, or explore an idea that's a little bigger and weirder than you can get your hands around in a short story, but still leave you wanting more.
Actually, I love reading novellas, but it's actually one of those really hard things for me to write, because my ideas do not come in that middle section. Like When the Devil is a novelette, and even that was originally a short story that got kind of like pushed out more and more until it actually was kind of accidentally a novelette.
I love a novelette.
But that's really just like a really long short story,
Right.
Like...
Give me a novelish, give me a novelesque, give me a noveltini.
And they are having a moment, which
Yes.
I think is really great, because I do think attention spans are shorter and people don't have as much time too. It's like people are so quick to be like, oh, everything's so instant. Like, that's why people don't have attention spans. I'm like, I don't know. I think a lot of people don't have time. And like, especially like a really big novel, it took me like 3 times to read The Stand, because I kept having to put it down and then I wouldn't remember who anybody was, because there's like 1,000 characters in that thing. And I would pick it up and be like, I really don't remember any of these people. I have to start over again. And that's super frustrating. Whereas in novella, you can knock that out. It's very doable.
Emma, where can our listeners find you online?
So I have a website, emmaemurray.com, and it's got links to all my socials and stuff. I definitely would recommend following me on Instagram. I'm going to be doing some giveaways for both the Drowning Machine and Shoot Me in the Face over the next few months. And so that's Emma E. Murray _ on Instagram, and Blue Sky, Emma E. Murray at Blue Sky, whatever that long thing. I haven't changed it.
Where can people go to add Shoot Me in the Face to their Goodreads pages?
I think I have it linked right now on my website, but it's really easy to find. It's the only book actually that's called Shoot Me in the Face on a Beautiful Day. So
good SEO.
You'll find it. All right. And yeah, definitely add it so you don't forget about it, because it's coming out in August. And then you can pre-order The Drowning Machine and Other Obsessions at Undertaker Books. It's also going to be on Amazon and stuff. I think it's going to be on like barnesandnoble.com and all that. We're going wide with it. But if you order it through Undertaker, you get the paperback and you get the ebook also for free. And you can also get the ebook from there. It's better to support the small press. It's better for me. It's better for them. It's better for everybody.
Emma, thank you for hanging out with us today.
Thank you for having me. It's super fun.
Please subscribe and follow. Links are in the show notes. You can find me at jeffccarter.com and hit the link to pick up my collection, We Bleed Orange and Black, 31 fun-sized tales for Halloween. Until next time, stay spooktacular.
Gonna be people doing stuff like that no matter what. You can't stop it.
No, you can't. And you're certainly not going to solve the situation by getting involved. I just would have gotten beaten to death by a bunch of drunk uncles with stalks of corn.